point of this panel discussion is really not so much about the data, but what neighborhoods are like, and what people that we're going to have up here who work in neighborhoods from different capacities, what they need for their day-to-day experiences. So we'll go right into it, and I'll allow each person to present themselves, give their location, the kind of work they do, and what perspective they're coming at it.
So I'll start. My name is Andray Domise, and I was a former financial planner that got into politics. Didn't turn out too well, but out of the work that we were able to do out in Rexdale, my business partner Sam and I have put together a program called Techsdale to get young kids involved in the tech industry by learning how to make video games and web development and doing apps and that sort of thing. Also, I consider myself a community advocate. The things that I've learned and picked up along with, during the city council race, along with, my past experience, it's kind of led me to believe that politicians are a heck of a lot more talk than action when it comes to certain communities, and the community that I grew up in, it makes me really upset that we're just not getting the help that we need.
Hi everybody, my name is Salomeh Ahmadi. I work in North Etobicoke, Rexdale at a not-for-profit called Pathways to Education. And I also helped create a group called Rexdale Lab, where we're citizens, professionals, anybody, it's inclusive, anybody who wants to come can kind of collaborate and come up with creative solutions and experiment around ideas and needs. So we're in the process of creating an app. We want to create a blog kind of narrative piece and some other projects. So I'm really interested in community development as a whole, something that's that kind of brings everyone to the table, right? Cross-sector, collaborative, shared responsibility, how we can be more process efficient, all those different elements that I think different industries definitely can bring to the table. So, and I work with youth, mostly.
So my name is Safiah Chowd. I am from Scarborough, so the other side of the city. Deep Scarborough is
That's why they put me all the way over here.
East, no, west, east.
East, yeah. So I grew up in Scarborough my whole life, Malvern, and I went away for school for 6 years and have recently returned. But throughout the time that I was away, I felt very, very connected to my communities. I consider them to have really raised me at the end of the day, and so feel a deep sense of commitment and dedication to them. And since I've been back, I'm working with Studio Y out of the Mars Discovery District. I'm working on a bunch of projects relating to community organizing and political engagement in particularly Scarborough. So the last municipal election, Scarborough was a hot ticket, and the two ways in which Scarborough is primarily spoken about is in terms of transit and crime, which totally eclipses all the other beautiful things happening in the area, which is massive. I mean, it was its own city. So I'm working on political engagement in the last municipal election. I'm working on one for youth engagement for the federal election. I'm also working on a community organizing initiative to bring together the many organizations, institutions, initiatives, and bring them together in a single space in order to be able to present a more cohesive voice for Scarborough, so that the voices that show up to the table aren't always just the same voices, which essentially at the end of the day means middle-aged homeowners.
Great, all right. So we have a community organizer, a community advocate, and a service provider. And we'll go into the other question, which is, how did you feel when the census got replaced or removed? Or actually, before I get into that, one of our other panelists is here, so we'll just get him to jump in and give his perspective. Andrew Doe.
Introduce yourself.
We're just doing introductions.
Hi, I'm Andrew Doe, TTC, yeah.
We'll talk about that. And
Scarborough?
yeah, so give your location and what perspective you're interested in.
So I'm Andrew, and I did a lot of stuff in open data neighborhoods. So I used to work at Save Toronto, working the strong neighborhood strategy. So that would be something interesting, because I'm sure everyone has had a lot to say about the long-form census. So I'm running out of breath as I ran here, but there are ways to work around it, and I would like to sort of inject some thoughts into kind of the data side of things. So I'll discuss kind of the technical side of things and sort of what data-driven tools exist, how they can be helpful, but also kind of like really question the values embedded in making those kind of tools as well. So
Really great. Thank you, Andrew. Catch your breath as we start talking about the census, which I know you'll have a lot to share with. But Andray, like from your point of view, the changes that recently happened with the census, how do you feel about that? And then what impact does that have in the community work that you do?
Well, I found it a bit offensive myself when I saw Prime Minister Stephen Harper jumping in on the Bell Let's Talk discussion, the hashtag Bell Let's Talk. And I found it offensive because the federal government, through the cancellation of the long-form census and also chopping back the kind of work that StatsCan normally does to collect data from various neighborhoods, I think it was like 7 different statistical measures that they used to measure what sort of mental health services are provided, which ones are being used, and where they're needed the most. Those stats were cut back, so there's nobody collecting data anymore. So at the same time that we're trying to encourage people to seek out, help for mental health issues and to make sure that it's no longer stigmatized, at the same time, we're cutting back the kind of information that we need to collect to know exactly where the help is needed the most. In neighborhoods like ours, I mean, we're all from Rexdale here, and trying to find things like, job stats, like, which are the most, which industries employ the most people, and what are the job trends looking like? Who are the people who are actually even getting jobs? So if you're a person of color, for example, do you stand a good chance getting a job when you come out of university as somebody who's not a person of color, or if you're a woman? And by cutting back all of those statistical measures, by not collecting that information, we have no idea where the help is needed and for whom. And it hits neighborhoods like ours the most because ours is, I mean, people might call it a quote-unquote majority-minority neighborhood, meaning that the majority of people living inside the neighborhood are people of color. It hits neighborhoods like ours the most because whenever there's some issue that either stigmatizes, punishes, or leaves people out, we tend to be affected the most.
Salomeh, why does data matter? I mean, like, I know my bus sucks. I don't need a data spread telling me, that we need rapid transit on Finch Avenue, right? Or I'm pretty sure poor people experience poverty in their day-to-day experiences. They do not need a census to tell them that the area they live in, is either high crime ridden or that, right? So why does the data matter?
Well, they have consultations for those, but for demographic data, the long form was vital. I mean, it had a really high return rate. It was like 98%. So right off the bat, it's like, why would you eliminate it? And the people who don't necessarily know about research and what's the point of having data and then analyzing and processing it into valuable information, well, the social determinants of health are connected, right? Like age and employment and educational attainment, all of that is necessary in terms of having kind of a baseline or some sort of starting point from which to provide either proactive or reactive services. And I mean, all that data is just, that's where most of it comes from, right? How else are we supposed to really target if we're not even using that quantitative information? Yeah, I think that's pretty much.
Great. Safiah, you say data, I say data. But in your case in Malvern, so recently Malvern was removed from the priority neighborhood list for whichever reasons were given. That is an example of how data, could change a community's perception or how government perceive that community's needs to be. So can you speak on that experience then?
Sure. So yeah, in the case of Malvern losing its designation as a priority neighborhood or neighborhood improvement area, it goes back to, that is related to just the different use of metrics now, and now Malvern doesn't fit into it. But what essentially that leaves us with is all these community programs that have been relying on this money for the last bunch of years, which now no longer have access to that increased funding. We just had a new family resource center that was built, and so now a lot of people are.
Sorry, you got to stop.
Very distracting.
Sorry, you're asking for what? Yes, I do have a USB, and I think I'm getting one right now. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, Andrew was on the committee actually, that nixed Malvern, so that's probably why he's trying to distract me. Yeah, so all these programs which have been relying on this funding, and we have a new family resource center that was built, and the programs now are, it's all now where the money is, essentially. It can't be holistic as it once was previously. And when it comes to the long-form census, one of the challenges is now just measuring success. So when I'm working on political engagement for youth, because we don't have a census to back up, to supplement the numbers on voting, we don't actually know whether we've reached youth. We don't know if we've really been able to access that segment of the population that we're trying to access. And this is really problematic, and because that we end up relying on a lot of anecdotal evidence, and that's so easy to delegitimize, and it often is challenged, especially at City Hall, especially in front of agencies, where one anecdote contradicts another anecdote, and there's nothing really necessarily to back it up, and it's going to pose a real big problem when it comes forward to accessing service and being able to tell people that you should invest in these community programs in Melbourne. We don't have data to back it up, and we don't have the money either from the city. So people in Melbourne are pretty nervous, and understandably so. We'll see what happens.
So Andrew, why did you nix Melbourne out of the list?
So the reason I wanted to get my PowerPoint is that I could sort of explain kind of the process behind it. I mean, just to give some context, I was a policy co-op student to do the strong neighborhoods strategy, so that was with the new improvement areas. And actually, I could just show kind of the chart, and then I can explain that. It's probably better if I show it, because I feel like data is one of those things you just have to show.
Leave it up to the TTC guy to turn a panel into a PowerPoint.
By the way, I also come from a neighborhood improvement area. There's 3 neighborhood improvement areas, but it's broadly known
Andrew,
as...
which one are we opening?
So there are a lot of them. Yeah.
Holy dude.
Yeah, I know. I haven't used this in a while.
Mexico.
Yeah, there's a lot. Someone needs to activate the PowerPoint. Shut up. So, strong neighborhoods strategy. So you will remember that in 2005, the way they collected data on that was if they were just trying to, they mostly used like public housing stock, crime statistics, for example. That was how they selected their priority neighborhoods, as they were called at the time. And what data can do for policy is, when the council debate happened, I was probably too young to remember it, but as I was told from city staff was that you had a lot of councillors debating the facts because it wasn't clear why they selected those indicators. And you had like areas like Regent Park excluded, for example. So like that from the original priority neighborhoods list when at the time the revitalization project was just starting up. So Regent Park in 2005 looks very different than Regent Park today. So just bear that in mind. So at the time there was a lot of sort of political decision, a lot of like politicking around like which neighborhoods get additional investments from the City of Toronto. So when you become a priority neighborhood, you get additional money from the city. It was mostly capital dollars, but it also like convened like a lot of stakeholders through Action for Neighborhood Change, and I believe the NAPs, so the Neighborhood Action Partnerships as well. So sorry, I'm speaking in like bureaucraties by using all these acronyms. But what is interesting about the new neighborhood improvements area is that they used a more of an evidence-based approach. So they weren't just selecting data, weren't quite sure why, where you had councillors debating the data itself. You had something called Urban Heart. Urban Heart, which stands for so the HEART stands for Health Equity Assessment and Research Tool, I believe. Health Equity Assessment, yeah, Research Tool. And it was based on a social determinants of framework. So this social determinants of framework based approach, and it was developed by the World Health Organization, so we actually had a lot of help from the World Health Organization, Polchansky, the Center for Research on Inter-City Health. There were over 80 researchers trying to develop the indicators, and it was a very, very long process to develop these indicators. So you had sort of 5 areas of where you can have social determinants of economic opportunity, social and human development, governance, physical, environment and infrastructure, and population health. And there were sort of 13 indicators that covered all these domains, bearing in mind that some indicators were problematic. Like, for example, governance was mostly civic participation. The only indicator they track is municipal voting rates, but we know that their civic engagement's a lot richer than just municipal voting rates. However, that was the only data available. So for something for the crowd to consider is maybe thinking of a way to develop data to really capture the full richness of civic engagement in a neighborhood. Because, there are certain people who don't vote, but they still are like involved in like their community of faith or their community center or soup kitchens, whatever the case might be. Mental health was also kind of problematic in the sense that it was all self-reported data, but in the absence of anything better, that's what we had. There were also some problems with basically some indicators are missing, like safety, for example, was kind of the big one that was mentioned a lot in the consultations. So there are sort of 13 indicators you can kind of look across, and the idea is, so green was to stand for neighborhoods that were sort of at benchmark and also like meeting the target as well. Yellow stood for meeting at benchmark, so kind of like a minimum threshold of what constitutes like, you know, a neighborhood like I should be doing, but not quite a target. So a target is like where we ideally would like to be, and red is those below the benchmark. So it's meant to capture like a high level. So Toronto has 140 neighborhood improvement areas. So that's how many neighborhood, oh, not improvement areas, but neighborhood planning areas that we have. Just bearing in mind, though, that the way the city officially defines neighborhoods might not be the way we define neighborhoods. So example, I live in Ward 25, no, Neighborhood Improvement Area 25, but which is kind of the Jane and Finch area. That being said, it includes 24, 25, 20, 27, and 26. And most people don't think about neighborhoods in that way. So something to bear in mind as well. Why Malvern was quote unquote nixed, just bearing in mind that the type of data we used for this iteration of strong neighborhoods versus the type of data we used in 2005 are not comparable at all. So you can't say that neighborhoods are doing worse off or better off based on 2005 because the data we used was very, very, very different data. So that's just something to bear in mind. So sorry if I sound like I'm a bit on the defensive, but that's kind of how it is. So that's just something to clear up, that you can't compare what we did what the city did in 2005 to 2013. And to really know that, though, you really have to look at the data. So
can
something
we see
to
Malvern in the spreadsheet?
So Malvern you actually can't see in the spread. You actually can't see it here.
Aging Corp what? Aging Corp Malvern what?
Yeah, Malvern would be roughly around here, right? So yeah, Malvern was one of those neighborhoods that didn't meet the kind of. So it used a health equity sort of assessment, which is one of those things that's not intuitive to understand. So from a data point of view, knowledge translation is important. Trying to say that this neighborhood is more equitable than another neighborhood is really, really intuitively hard to grasp. So it's really a knowledge translation issue that, to be fair, is something that I think the City of Toronto can do a better job as. And that's probably something where you know, the app development community can add a lot of value, is actually in that knowledge translation piece to really make that sort of intuitive. But I'll get into how that knowledge translation can also be problematic at times.
So while you're still up, I'll get you to start off on the other question, which is, what data matters when we're trying to understand neighborhoods, right? So who lives there, how people experience their neighborhoods.
So I had an entire PowerPoint, so I was going to take you all down, but because this is meant to be a discussion, I'll do it. So I think even before we ask that question, we really need to be clear what is the data actually saying. So for example, if I were to say crime statistics, where is that crime statistic coming from? Is it coming from the census metropolitan area? So this is something that Statistics Canada officially uses to collect their crime statistics. Are we talking about police divisions at that? Or are we talking about the ward? Or are we talking about the neighborhood planning area? The geography which you collected, as you can see, the boundaries are not coterminous with one another. So that's something to consider. For example, where like you really, really need to be clear, like when we're talking about crime statistics, where is it actually being reported at? What is actually being included in that? And I think a lot of people just, I'm not convinced, fully scrutinize like where does the data actually come from. Another interesting thing, like there's all this talk about data analytics, big data, all that stuff, and that usually involves combining data sets. So I pulled something from Toronto, and I pulled something from New York City, 311 data. New York City has a lot of indicators. In Toronto, you're only getting 3 headers. You're going to get this is 311. So when you call 311 and you can complain about the service. In this case, I chose to look at rats, like rat complaints. So you only get the creation date, where the location was, so PVP, whatever, and the service request type, which says IPM. What does IPM even mean? You really have to, so you need to pull another data set to translate that. That means integrated pest management. But what does that actually mean? Are we talking about rats? Are we talking about raccoons? Are we talking about squirrels? Are we talking about cockroaches? It's not very clear what it means. In New York City, because the data is more granular, and mind you, like this row goes on and on and on and on. Like they have, like it's very granular. Like, is the building a school? Yes, no, yes, no. Like is it, how many floors does it have? 3 or 4 floors. It even gives you the latitude and longitude of like the actual location. So we can talk about privacy concerns there, because then you actually know who actually complained about a rat. And in New York City, there are rats everywhere. Like there's actually a map, there's actually like a portal that just maps out where all the rats in New York City is. In Manhattan, it's just a brick of red. It's just a block of red. So it gives you what agency is responsible for it. Here you don't see what agency or division is responsible for it. Complaint type, why did they report it? Well, I saw a rat. location type, building, even the zip code, and the exact address. So it's very, very granular. But that being said, does integrated pest management and are rats and rodents the same thing, for example? So just being clear what the data actually means. But usually when you try to merge data sets, like the data isn't quite, like they're not defining the data the same way. So just something to be very, very clear that at the end of the day, even though this is open data day and we usually think about app developers and whatnot, at the end of the day, it's still like a statistical exercise. So you really still need to understand what the data is trying to tell you and why the data was collected the way it was. And in terms of what neighborhood data would be important, it's interesting because this is kind of like, there are a lot of tools out there. I know I'm being very long-winded. So Wellbeing Toronto is one. The way the city officially describes it, supports decision-making, engages citizens and businesses. So looking at all the 140 neighborhood planning areas, you can actually map out all the indicators, age group, ethnicity, crime rates even, but also map out all like the official community centers, which usually tend to be like United Way-funded agencies. There's obviously a gap in data that like not every community agency is a United Way-funded agency. That kind of stuff. And this is meant to be sort of like, a value neutral thing. This is what, so the staff who developed this, his name is Harvey Lowe. He really, really wanted me to say this, but saying that this is actually not open data. This is actually open. This is more kind of like something he calls open analysis, giving citizens the tools to actually just play with the data and come to their own conclusions. You can actually download the data sets from there. So if you download, like, if you map out, like, where do all the youth live, for example. They're broken down to age groups, then you can just directly download them. That being said, let's look at another app that, for example, I can find problematic in terms of what kind of neighborhood information really, really matters. So this is an app called Place I Live. It was actually just reported in the Atlantic. It was made by a guy. So this is kind of New York City, because New York City, when we talk about cities, we have to talk about New York, apparently. So, and it's interesting because the founder of it said, we just genuinely believe that if there are more educated people, it is a nicer neighborhood, and the same with income. He explicitly said this, right? And so the point of this app is it actually maps out how livable a neighborhood is. And then we have to remember, like, well, but like, who would actually use this app? So it's interesting, I actually played around with it. And one of the indicators where, so on the daily life thing, things like where are all the frozen yogurt stores and where are all the wine stores? So just to give an anecdote, they have other stuff like the amount of schools and stuff like that, but if you don't have enough wine stores, well, that hurts your daily life, your livability index, right? Just to give an example, 2 years ago, I was with my friend in Jamaica and Queens. I know, surprise, people go to New York to other places rather than Manhattan and Brooklyn, and by Brooklyn, more than just Williamsburg and Greenpoint. That's beside the point. The point is, like, if you look at all the wine stores, of course, all of them are here. Jamaica doesn't, which is roughly around here, doesn't really have any wine stores, but that still hurts its livability index. Is that the kind of data that really matters to residents living in Jamaica and Queens? So that's something to think about. What data are we actually reporting out? So that's a very, very long-winded way to say.
Thank you so much. Have a seat. Stay beside your beautiful PowerPoint. Yeah, you want to? Okay. So data is great and all, but stories matter more. And Andray, you ran recently in War II, and how was that experience at the door? Do you think people care about the numbers and the facts?
Well, it's really hard to connect the data with people's lived and on-the-ground experience. So we were talking about priority neighborhoods a second ago, and Rexdale is no longer a priority neighborhood. But if you talk to the people and see what some of the living conditions are like, it definitely needs to be a priority neighborhood, or at least a good portion of the city's attention needs to be paid towards areas like Rexdale and Malvern. And it's strange to me because if you go across the river and you see the conditions over at like the Emery/Ann Finch area, it's not really much different than it is over in Rexdale. I think it's maybe the percentage of homeowners and the expansive real estate that might have pulled it out of the priority neighborhood status. But when we talk about things like community centers and libraries, even being able to get to a grocery store, there's not a single bookstore. Like, there's no. I don't want to use chapters as an indication of how good a neighborhood is, but because frankly, I've got a lot of problems with chapters. There is a frozen yogurt store, yes, at Woodland Center. But no, you can't go around the neighborhood and find even a bookstore. So it's problematic to me, the way that we assemble the data and then use that to assign statuses to certain neighborhoods and say, well, this neighborhood needs attention and this one doesn't necessarily need it anymore. I mean, you know, Salomeh and I belong to an organization, I guess it's, the umbrella organization is called Rexdale Lab. So she's with Pathways to Education, which is under the auspices of Rexdale Community Health Center. I'm starting up my own nonprofit called Texdale. But there's a bunch of other people in the neighborhood and organizations in the neighborhood that are coming together to try and make our neighborhood a much more livable place. And one of the biggest issues that we have is, well, being able to collect information on our neighborhood is a challenge in and of itself. Without that information, how can you make a case to the city that we need more help? So it's, instead of using data, we're using our anecdotal cases, we're using our neighborhood experiences, we're using the conversations that we've had with residents to say, well, our neighborhood is generally saying this. So I understand, I get the importance of data, but I think what we sometimes miss in that is, what does the data translate into? What are people's actual experiences on the ground? How easy is it for them to get to work in the morning? How many daycares are in their neighborhood? Are they even able to afford sending their kids to daycare? How long of a trip is it to work? How much money are they making? How much are their homes worth? Things like that, like, it paints a picture of a neighborhood that I don't think is complete without talking to actual residents. And I think that that's generally what's missing in these conversations.
The qualitative data.
Right.
Yeah. Salomeh, as a service provider, you're in the perfect position to understand the reports as they come through from a bird eye view, but also the experiences of people coming at you every day that you help with your program. Do you see a disconnect, or what can we do more of?
So there's definitely a lot of elements. I think the fundamentals is really like going back to like data, like that raw info, which really stems from what you ask and how you ask it. That's going to determine what you get, right? And not only that, but who's at the table. I think a lot of people have been sharing this. Who's at the table? You're not going to have, you know, someone with a six-figure salary talking about poverty. You're going to have the residents, you're going to have constituents like that. And two examples I can think of that are more quantitative, I guess, one would be like safety statistics. I mean, getting information, getting that data is not just going to be sufficient from, say, whatever databases there are, because we know that like emergency, non-emergency reports are not necessarily, not everyone's, you know, documenting them, not everyone's making the calls, they're underreported, all that kind of stuff, so that would skew what is safety and what's the definition of safety and who's reporting it and who's capturing the information, and then what do you do with that, right? How do you organize it? Is it top down? Where is it from? And then the other thing, another example would be education. So educational attainment. Are you just going to have, you know, the TDSB apart from, say, the organization I work for, Pathways to Education? Are we going to be doing our separate research? And that is what we do. As a national organization, we have our own researcher, and then TDSB has their own staff. But what is educational attainment? I mean, some of the students that I work for, they have, you know, the label of an IEP, but that's kind of put on them as opposed to, you know, proper procedures and proper assessments of what is their needs. And then it also is connected to, you know, to moving further back, like elementary level learning and the curriculum and policies around that, and how do we navigate and catch up to how do we produce a more effective curriculum? How do we make education more accessible and more attainable? And then what do we use to measure, right? So there's a lot of different issues in terms of that. And going back to what you shared is really we are kind of taking it into our own hands, because data is not necessarily there's that huge gap, right? Like who's capturing all the data, what is it capturing, who's at the table, and then we have to kind of, people on the front lines have to use that. It doesn't translate, doesn't make sense, it's not relevant necessarily to the everyday lives. So we are taking it on into our own hands to kind of capture more of the qualitative elements, but then also we're being smart about it and capturing the impacts and what do we use to define what will success be, what are our goals and objectives, and how do we reach that. And we do have tools, resources, I mean, all of that's more democratized. It's everywhere. We just need people who are passionate and committed to kind of use that. So my background in program evaluations, well, I can bridge some of that gap and those gaps in understanding. So I think it's really important to bring all of that mishmash of stuff to the table and kind of separate it all out and bring people together to talk about the real lived experiences, and then also that the impacts, which is sometimes, you know, for government we have to not necessarily we have to speak their jargon, but sometimes they are just what are the numbers? I want to see the facts. I want to see the figures. So that's not. I work in frontline. That's not what's meaningful to my youth. That's not what's meaningful to me, right? So there's a lot of gaps to work with, and how do we mesh all of that together? It's not just okay. Well, let's look at the gap here. Let's separate all the gaps into columns. Well, it's not that easy, right? So.
One other thing before you move on is it's not just a matter of what information is being collected, but it's also a matter of who's collecting the information. So there was a study that was conducted last year, which the Toronto Police threw a fit over, the community assessment of police practices, and that was.
We're getting to that, policing and data.
Okay.
Is it with that?
Well, what I did want to say is that it's without an overarching body that's sort of inassailable in its objectivity, i.e. Statistics Canada, which, I mean, you can say what you want about them, but for a long time we did simply accept what they said as gospel because the information was being collected in a very objective manner. Now I think it's been highly politicized. That when you get smaller organizations and groups who, I mean, because we have no ability to collect the data otherwise, it's only the people who are highly interested and have the free time that are going to go out and collect that data. So when you have the community assessment of, or let's call it the CAP report that was being released with a survey of 471 residents instead of the 31 division catchment, meaning that the residents who live in the area that's being policed by Toronto Police 31 Division, they came away with a really negative outlook on the officers that are policing them. And a lot of them said that even though carding isn't supposed to be standard practice in this area, we're still being carded, we're still being stopped and spoken to without any reason for it. It's basically arbitrary detention. And so the police completely lambasted the report, saying that it's slanted, it's not objective, that the organization had an agenda, but of course, you're only going to get organizations with an agenda studying this data when you take away the ability to study the data objectively.
And we'll get to policing and data more, because that's a good example. What about you, Safiah? In Melbourne, do you see the same gaps between data and lived experiences?
Yeah, definitely. And as I was saying at the beginning is whenever there's a town hall or a consultation, I've been attending a bunch now, and also when I was a few years ago, I used to attend all of them. And I was always the only person under the age of 40, probably the only person who's not a service provider or who isn't affiliated with an organization. And oftentimes, which is crazy for Scarborough, but oftentimes the only person of color. And so a lot of times the people who are showing up, who have the time to show up, are people who are homeowners or affiliated with a service organization. I found it also similar during the municipal election, where even the places that they know where to go still go to this one particular demographic, whereby, for example, and my parents are implicated in this as well, where they want subways because it increases property value. Whereas for someone like me, I want transit so I can get downtown faster. It's not about property value, and that inevitably skews the ways in which people shape policy and put it in their platforms. And so anecdotal evidence has that, I guess, that danger to it, in that the only people who are heard are the people who have the time and the resource and the knowledge to be able to speak. And so, whereas I think lived experience is so important, and that should all the time supplement any kind of information that's being provided. So far, at least what I've seen is that in all the consultations in town halls, it's always been this replication of privilege. And now as I'm attending them more, the thing is, I think that people are sincere and they would like to outreach to more of a diverse population, but for some reason they don't know how, even though I think it's pretty simple. For example, they had the budget consultations for this last budget, but they had it at Scarborough Civic Center. There were 15 people present, and they were saying, we're trying to come up. We came out to the burbs, and only 15 people showed up. Well, the Scarborough Civic Center is attached to the mall, which has maybe 4,000 people. So, anyway, small things like that can bolster the ways in which qualitative data is taken, and also that's more representative of actual neighborhoods, as opposed to just repeatedly privileging some voices. And I guess that's where quant comes in handy. But anyway, there's always challenges.
Well, even to add to your point, I mean, I know we're getting to policing in a second.
Yeah, just to get it to Andrew.
Sure.
Keep your policing, we'll get to that.
Okay.
But Andrew's already ready to jump.
About this one.
And I know, I guess the question I want to ask you is, hearing all of this, what are the difficulties for policymakers in capturing that qualitative data and the nuances of neighborhoods?
So the qualitative data you mostly collected through consultations. And consultations, I think Safiah sort of mentioned kind of the problems with consultations and obviously the challenges of consultation. For example, let's talk about strong neighborhoods, for example. There's a poverty reduction strategy, there's a youth equity strategy, there's all these other strategies. They may not necessarily align. All the people responsible for doing those strategies have their own consultation. So you end up talking 3 times about roughly the same issues. And then the question then becomes like, well, I've talked to you once before, I've said this before, why am I here again? I'm wasting my time. And then the person has to do it, they have to, because they're always written out, and then they have to go back and type it all out. And you see the same thing over and over and over again. So even from a policy practitioner's point of view, how much value add can that actually be if you already kind of know what's going to be said? And most of the time, it tends to be kind of confirmed that you have to do that. I think the problem is that it is kind of sometimes, it is somewhat, I don't want to say it's seen as a check mark, mostly because I'm bearing in mind that I do have somewhat of a biased perspective. There are good people in the city of Toronto working on this, and they care a lot about consultation, but just knowing that maybe we really have to rethink the way we do it, and I don't know what that would look like. But even on service providers, the city provides funding to these service providers as well, but we don't actually have data and information on these service providers. So I was just to prepare for this, I was talking to my manager who was responsible for rolling out the strong neighborhood strategy, and she said something that would be very value added is just some way to have information on like, do residents actually like the services they're getting currently? Because like something like a Yelp for service providers, because we don't have that.
Yeah.
And because we know that some service providers probably do a better job than other service providers. I don't think I'm making a controversial claim in saying that.
But you're not going to hear it from them.
But you won't hear it from, well.
And then the residents are not coming to the consultation.
Yeah, and it's
so
usually.
where are we going to find that data?
Yeah, and so the information comes from service providers, and I can give an anecdote doing a consultation where, like, for example, security cameras on TCHC properties is a very controversial. Whether that works or not is something to be worthy of debate. But I will say that, I won't name the organization, but one organization came to a consultation and said, it's like, I've talked to the residents, and they all unanimously do not want Toronto community. They do not want security cameras on Toronto community housing properties there because, it encourages a culture of snitching and whatever the argument is against. It's not effective, whatever the case might be, but living there, I know for a fact there are a lot of residents that want there, so that didn't jive with me. But me, as a public servant, had to take that information down and take it as a given, because our job isn't to scrutinize whether it is necessarily true. Our job is just to capture that lived experience. I think the value of data, though, is to put that lived experience in the broader in that context about, like, because mostly with lived experience, you know other people who are somewhat kind of, I don't want to say are kind of like you, but you talk to your friends, and they may report the same experiences, but you might not talk to all of your neighborhoods. So once you get the broader picture, you can contextualize. The challenge is that information isn't, I wouldn't say is accessible. And Wellbeing Toronto tries to do that, but certainly, I had trouble learning how to use it, for example, and and that's a tool meant to.
Yeah.
5 minutes and a question.
Okay. Oh wow. That's great because I know, Salma, you went to the poverty reduction strategy meeting in Rexdale, and you went to the Malvern, and I remember. So 130 or 140 people came out to the Parkdale one, but only 30 people came out to the Rexdale one.
Yeah, but I think that was a limitation of the space and where it's located. And I don't even think a lot of people even knew that it was coming up.
Probably not, yeah. So there definitely wasn't a diverse representative. I definitely didn't see, knowing all the organizations, I didn't see, but then there were also some residents. So I don't know how, some students from Humber, yeah. So
what is needed from that? Just what can we do to get the right people giving us the right data? What's wrong with the consultative process?
Because the
do we have time? We have 5 minutes per
question. Where do you want me to start? Okay, I don't want to sound like I'm holding a grudge here, but there are 2 city councillors in the Rexdale neighborhood, right? There's Rob Ford and Vince Crisanti. There's no way around that. Vince Crisanti, to his credit, did show up. He was there just for the opening, then he had to go to another event. Councillor Pam McConnell was there. She brought her staff. I mean, she had spoken about this event. I'd seen it on her Twitter feed, and she'd spoken openly about having this consultation, poverty reduction strategy consultation at the Rexdale hub. I didn't hear jack from Rob Ford about any of this stuff. He didn't show up to the event, and granted, I get that he's in treatment and so forth. But when there's an issue that's of utmost importance to him, I don't know, making sure that the mayor doesn't go to Ottawa and waste our tax dollars, I don't know, trying to get money from the federal government, he'll be right in front of the cameras talking about it. But when it comes to dealing with an issue in his own backyard, he's absolutely silent on it. So I think that we need to expect better from some of our elected representatives, that when we have issues like this coming up and we want to get input from the neighborhood, like that needs involvement not just from the city staff or not just from community activists, but also from the people that we elect to represent us.
There are lots of challenges with consultation processes. I think the biggest, well, I don't know if this is the biggest one, but I think like the delay in relaying information and the follow-up, because I think we have copious amounts of municipal, provincial, and federal documents documenting poverty, equity, safety, violence, everything. We have all that. We have a lot of data, quantitative and qualitative, out there. We use those in our reports and funding and all that kind of stuff when we know how. But that delay, you have all the information, the data, and then the delay to relay it and then act upon it. Like that for me is really difficult. Like I'm to be honest, I'm kind of tired of consultations, but I still show up, and I see people who say they'll, that are not there. So I'm really tired of that kind, because it's like, well, I'm waiting for what next? What's going to happen?
And what about the amount of time that it's going to take to implement this now?
Exactly, yeah. So it was like a year-long kind of pre-planning or whatever it is they did, phase 1, phase 2, and they have all the right language, and I commend them for doing really kind of participatory and interactive, and using all the right terms. And then, but then I'm kind of the boat that it's like I have to sit and wait every time, right? So something like the roots of violence, which was like 10 years ago or something like that. I don't even know, but you just sit and wait. You just sit and wait. So that gap is really, and I think it's about the fact that we work too separately and redundant in a redundant manner. Let's come together, let's consolidate, and it's really about creating the space somewhere else to do it. Because again, I think someone asked in the earlier session, it's like, how do I present this idea to my ED? Well, they're adverse to change, and they don't necessarily understand, or whatever the reasons are. You have to kind of create that alternative. So using the tools and information to do that, and consultation is one element, and it has success, it has its benefits, but then we also have to do more after. So yeah.
We should probably do questions.
Sure.
I'm sure there's a lot of questions. And
yeah.
I want to hear some good news. Can you anecdotally data something, a single small thing that works, that can, at an intersection, a street level, I don't know, but then you understand can be scaled citywide, and forget Mississauga, forget the region, the CMA, the whole, but just something positive.
So I think there's a lot of positive things that can come, and I think a lot of that requires, at least what I've seen in Malvern and Scarborough, is taking that, just removing the bureaucracy around it and just focusing in and honing in on this sense of neighborhood belonging, which people have a strong sense of. And they really strongly identify with their neighbors, they strongly identify with their hood, and that's where a lot of power is found. So I think that just in simple conversations, that's why I think it's actually not that difficult to consult if you just go to the places people already are. And they're open and they talk. We ran, Andrew and I and a few others, we ran a Get Out the Vote campaign in Malvern for the last municipal election. And what we did is, people are not interested in municipal politics. Our councillor, the city, there's a bunch of reasons why they're not interested in it. And when we went out just to prototype some, or just to speak to them as to their interests, people were saying, I don't care about municipal politics. It's never been relevant to me. All I care about is my car. And then you engage them in conversation, well, your car is affected by roads and this and that, and then suddenly they're interested in municipal politics. And so when we made our literature, we focused it, we really honed in on particular neighborhood interests. So we asked questions like, do you enjoy your long commute? Do you think that this neighborhood is over/under policed? How's daycare? Things like that. People felt very invigorated by those questions. And that then connected them to how relevant municipal politics are in their lives.
And where did you go to find them?
And so we found them in parking lots. We found them at the bus stop. The mall. We found. Well, I wasn't kicked out. You were kicked out.
Andrew, you're the guy.
Yeah. Well, anyway, but the other thing is that a lot of people were resistant. We also went to community housing and cooperative housing, but people were resistant to talking to us until I told them, I'm from here, I grew up here myself, and then they were much more open. They understood that I also had a vested interest, because there's a huge distrust massive distrust, and I think it requires empowering community champions and giving them a lot of the backing, a lot of the resource backing, a lot of the power backing in order to be able to affect a lot of that change. Because when it comes top down, people legitimately are distrustful. I'm distrustful. And so when it comes from the bottom up, it's really, really amazing. I think there's also a lot of power in, for example, in Malvern, the religious sites, the mosque, between the mosque and the churches, you can reach about maybe 15, 16,000 people. And they have, I mean, some of the churches have these things where they have like pray for streets, where they'll go to an individual street that has been in the news or something happened with the family, something like that, and they'll gather all these people together in order to like pray for the road. And if people can work together in order to bolster already these highly localized initiatives, that's where I think a lot of the power rests. Being able to connect that to power and connect that to change is where the work lies, I think. But I'm very, very inspired by everyone in my neighborhood daily. And I find a lot of inspiration and a lot of beauty behind that. So I think that's good news.
Very, very quick story. So I was saying in 2005, you had councilors debating the facts on like which neighborhoods actually needed additional money. In 2013, we were all expecting the same debate. It didn't happen because the evidence was very, very, very compelling and very, very strong. And that shows the power of data. We were actually surprised that like no one debated the facts. They all accepted the recommendation, and strong neighborhoods, like it passed without almost no debate because the evidence was so strong. You didn't have councilors saying, "Why is this neighborhood getting money? Why isn't mine?" For example, they just accepted. I mean, whether I'm not quite convinced why, but I'd like to think that was because the evidence was strong.
I don't know. I would also challenge that though, because for example, I think that for my councilor, Raymond Cho, if he feels happy that we've lost designation for this priority neighborhood, to him it's seen as an improvement in the neighborhood.
That's another debate. But how about you guys from Rexdale Lab?
I think, like apologies for our default mode of being cynical and pointing out all these flaws in the system, but we're definitely like through Rexdale Lab, one of the things we kind of identified was this negative stereotype of communities. So, I mean, we got stuck in kind of problem defining mode, and I think like we should all be mindful of that. I think we tend to do that way too much in every element of research. I've heard it everywhere. So then we started thinking about, oh, are we going to point the finger at like the police or racism? This? Well, no. How about we change? How about we pause and change the narrative and create? So one of our stories, we're going to create a blog emphasizing the positive stories of resiliency and adversity and success and triumph of our community, because there is nothing like that exists, mainstream media or otherwise. And I mean, that could do multiple things, right? Like increase hope, decrease isolation, be motivated, recognize civic participation, recognize all the different layers that individuals are contributing to a community that's been, an improvement, priority neighborhood, right? So creating those alternative narratives, whether they're quantitative or qualitative, and then capturing that somehow and documenting it is one of the ways that Rexdale Lab is approaching that. And it starts with being innovative, experimenting, piloting, bringing everyone together and coming up with solutions and being like, oh, hey, wait, why are we just pointing the finger? Why are we just doing this? Why are we doing this? Why not try this? Why not try this? So being open to that is a really great way to introduce positivity and not be working from that mind frame of austerity and lack and, oh, wait, we have to wait for a grant. Oh, wait, we have to do this, right? So
yeah, I really like that. You say you're looking for a good news story, but I mean, connecting with Salomeh and the other people who were involved in Rexdale Lab, nobody's waiting for the municipal government or really any level of government to step in and do something. When we had that poverty reduction strategy meeting last week, and I asked Councillor McConnell, well, how long are we looking at timeline-wise to get this thing off the ground? She says 5 years. So in other words, we'll have to wait for another municipal election to happen and hope that whoever's elected doesn't just shoot the whole thing down. But you have people who are just getting together on a monthly basis saying, how can we make improvements to our neighborhood? And then just going off and doing that and using each other, bouncing it off each other as a resource. And also to point to, just outside of the Rexdale core, my business partner Sam and I are part of the Agents of Change program with Center for Social Innovation, and we met really cool people, like Luke, for example, who runs the program called Stopgap, where he's building ramps to create accessibility into storefronts that normally don't have accessibility for people in wheelchairs. Or somebody like Farah Khan, who created like a walking group out in Regent Park. Like when she told me the amount of connection that our neighborhood was able to create just by getting people out of their homes and walking together, it's amazing. Like they're like planting gardens and creating like community groups that meet up on a Sunday. So there's a lot of people doing the work on the ground that you're just not hearing about. I think where it comes to Rexdale, the news vans tend to follow the police sirens. But if you just talk to people in the neighborhood who are sort of doing the work like Salomeh is, you find a lot of good news stories coming out of that.